What you're about to hear is a true story. Date: September 11th, 1857. Location: Washington County, Utah Territory. The air inside the wagon circle tasted of sulfur and urine. For 5 days, the 120 men, women, and children of the Baker-Fancher party had been pinned to the floor of the high desert valley. They were crouching behind wheels that had rolled 2,000 miles from the lush Ozarks, only to stall here, in a patch of sagebrush that offered no cover and no mercy. They were dying of thirst. The spring was only 100 yards away, bubbling cool and clear out of the red earth. But it might as well have been on the moon. Every time a man crawled out with a bucket, the Indians on the ridge opened fire. 2 men were already dead. Others were rotting in the heat, their wounds festering. The children had stopped crying. They were too dehydrated to make sound. Then, the impossible happened. A wagon appeared on the northern rise. Not a war party. A wagon. White men. To the beleaguered Arkansans, it looked like a hallucination. A white flag. A simple square of cloth. Perhaps a pillowcase fluttered from a stick. The man holding it wore the rough homespun of a settler. Not the war paint of the Paiutes they believed had been besieging them. A cheer, dry and cracked, rose from the corral. Captain Alexander Fancher, the leader of the train, must have felt a surge of relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees. He ordered the barricades lowered. The man who walked into the camp was Major John D. Lee. He was a man of intense charisma, a jagged silhouette against the blinding sun. He spoke with the authority of the church and the militia. He told them that the local Paiutes were in a blood frenzy, but he had negotiated a truce. He could get them out safely, back to Cedar City. But there were conditions, strict conditions. To appease the warriors watching from the ridges, the immigrants had to surrender their arms, all of them. The rifles, the revolvers, the Bowie knives. They had to be loaded into the militia's wagon, covered with blankets to hide them from the savages. It was a suicide pact. Every instinct in a frontiersman's brain would have screamed against it, giving up your weapon in hostile territory. But they were exhausted, they were parched, and this was a white man, a Christian, offering salvation. They complied. The rifles clattered into the wagon bed. Lee organized the exodus with military precision. It was a procession of the damned. First, the wagon with the guns, driven by the militia. Next, the wagon carrying the wounded and the smallest children. Then, the women and older children walking on foot in a single file line. Finally, the men. They were ordered to march a quarter mile behind the women. Each emigrant man walked alongside an armed Mormon militia escort, ostensibly for protection. The column stretched out across the meadow. The silence was absolute, save for the crunch of boots on gravel and the creak of wagon axles. The sagebrush stood waist-high, a gray-green sea waiting to swallow them. Major Lee rode ahead. He watched the spacing. He checked the ridges. He waited until the women had rounded a small hill, disappearing from the view of their husbands. He waited until every emigrant man was perfectly flanked by a militia guard. He halted his horse. He turned in the saddle. His silhouette cut a hole in the blue sky. He raised his hand, then slashed it down. His voice rang out, cracking the silence like a whip. "Do your duty, Israel." In a single, synchronized motion, the militia guards turned on the unarmed men walking beside them. The muzzles of their muskets were inches from the Arkansans' chests. The volley was a single, tearing sound. The statement you're about to hear is a documented written statement by Nancy Sophronia Huff, a child survivor of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Recorded years later, it remains one of the only first-hand accounts from inside the camp, told by someone who lived only because she was too young to be killed.
After we had gone some distance, The men were shot down. I saw my father fall. The women were then killed, and the children were taken away. I was carried off by one of the men. The children were afterward taken to the settlements and placed with families. I was taken to Cedar City, where I remained for some time. This statement is true to the best of my knowledge and remembrance. Nancy Sophronia Huff.
"4 months earlier, Arkansas." To understand the butchery in the sagebrush, we must first understand what was lost. History has a habit of reducing victims to statistics. 120 dead. But the Baker-Fancher party was not a collection of faceless drifters. They came from the verdant counties of northern Arkansas: Carroll, Marion, Boone. These were not desperate Dust Bowl refugees. They were the landed gentry of the frontier. They were the Ozark aristocracy. Captain Alexander Fancher was a colossus of a man. A veteran of the trail, he had already made the trip to California twice. He knew the water holes. He knew the tribes. He knew the unforgiving geometry of the mountains. He was leading a coalition of families, the Bakers, the Camerons, the Dunlaps, who had liquidated successful farms to build a new empire in the Golden State. They traveled with immense wealth. The Fancher train was a mobile treasury. They drove nearly 900 head of cattle, specifically Durham bulls and high-yield milk cows. A herd worth upwards of $100,000 in 1857 currency, nearly $3.5 million today. They carried gold coins sewn into the hems of dresses and hidden in false bottoms of wagons. They had racehorses, carriages, and pianos. When they rolled out of Arkansas in the spring of 1857, the mood was electric. They were well armed, well provisioned, and led by a man who had never failed. They were an unstoppable force of American optimism. But they were driving straight into a geopolitical buzzsaw, the kingdom of the beehive. While the Fancher party moved west, the territory of Utah was curdling into a state of existential terror. To the modern mind, it is difficult to grasp the psychological temperature of Utah in 1857. It was not merely a religious settlement. It was a theocracy under siege. Brigham Young, the Lion of the Lord, ruled not just as a prophet, but as a territorial governor and a king in all but name. But the walls were closing in. In Washington, D.C., President James Buchanan had declared the Mormons in rebellion. He had dispatched 2,500 U.S. troops, fully one-third of the standing army, to march on Salt Lake City, depose Young, and install a federal governor. News of Buchanan's army hit Utah like a hammer strike. It confirmed every persecution complex the Saints had nurtured since their expulsion from Missouri and the murder of Joseph Smith. They weren't just facing political replacement. They believed they were facing annihilation. Brigham Young declared martial law. He issued a scorched earth policy. If the army entered the valley, the Saints would burn their own homes, cut down their own orchards, and retreat into the mountains, leaving the soldiers nothing but a wasteland. But more dangerously, Young and his counselors unleashed a psychological weapon, the Reformation. Throughout 1856 and 1857, the rhetoric from the pulpit turned violent. To bind the community together against the coming storm, leaders preached the doctrine of blood atonement. The theory was visceral. Some sins were so great that the blood of Christ was insufficient to cleanse them. To save a sinner's soul, their own blood had to be spilled upon the ground. Jedediah Grant, Young's second counselor, thundered, "I say that there are men and women that I would advise to go to the president immediately and ask him to appoint a committee to attend to their case. And then let a place be selected, and let them shed their blood to atone for their sins." It was a metaphorical cleansing that listeners began to interpret literally. The atmosphere in southern Utah became toxic, remote, harsh, and fiercely loyal to Young. Neighbors watched neighbors. Dissent was treason. And Gentiles, non-Mormons, were no longer just strangers. They were the enemy. They were the spies for the approaching army. They were the ones who had killed the prophet Joseph. In August 1857, the Fancher train crossed the border into Utah. They expected a resupply stop. They expected to trade their weary draft animals for fresh ones, to buy grain and flour. It was the standard rhythm of the trail. Instead, they hit a wall of ice. Brigham Young had issued a war edict. Grain is for the saints, not a kernel for the Gentiles. The territory was hoarding food for the coming siege. As the Fancher party moved south through the settlements of Provo, Springville, and Fillmore, they were met with closed doors and cold stares. They waved gold coins, but the settlers refused to sell. The emigrants were baffled. They were Americans on American soil, yet they were being treated like an invading force. The friction created sparks. Frustration mounted among the Arkansas men. Watching their women grow gaunt and their cattle thin, they reportedly lashed out. Some boasted that they had participated in the mobs that drove the Mormons out of Missouri. A claim likely born of anger rather than fact, but fatal nonetheless. One man reportedly swung a bullwhip and decapitated a chicken in the street of a Mormon town, shouting, "That's what we'll do to Brigham Young." Rumors flew ahead of the wagon train, like embers in a high wind. They poisoned the spring at Corn Creek. They gave poisoned meat to the Indians. They have the gun that killed Joseph Smith. By the time the train reached Cedar City, the last outpost of civilization before the grueling Mojave Desert, the narrative had been set. These weren't families. They were a vanguard of the U.S. Army. In Cedar City, the local stake president and militia commander was Isaac C. Haight. He was a man consumed by the zealotry of the Reformation. He watched the Fancher train roll past his town, rich, defiant, and vulnerable. He didn't see people. He saw an opportunity. He saw a way to prove his loyalty to the kingdom, to secure wealth for the war effort, and to exact vengeance for the ghosts of the past. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed the battle axe of the Lord. He needed the Indians to provide the cover story. And he needed John D. Lee. September 3rd to 6th, 1857. The massacre was not a crime of passion. It was a bureaucratic process. It began not with a gunshot, but with a handshake in the dark. Isaac Haight, the stake president and mayor of Cedar City, was a man vibrating with the intensity of the Holy War. He was the ecclesiastical hammer of southern Utah. But he needed a sickle. He summoned Major John D. Lee. Lee was a legend in the territory, the adopted son of Brigham Young. He was a frontiersman of almost mythical capability, a man who could speak the Paiute dialects fluently, who could farm the desert, and who followed orders with a terrifying literalism. They met in the shadows of Cedar City. The plan they hatched was a masterpiece of plausible deniability. It was a false flag operation a century before the term existed. The logic was cold. The Fancher train was a threat. They had insulted the faith. They were enemies. But the militia could not openly slaughter a wagon train of American citizens without drawing the full wrath of the U.S. Army. The solution? The savage narrative. They would incite the local Southern Paiute bands. They would tell the tribal leaders that the Maricats, Americans, were coming to kill them, that they had poisoned the water, that they were an existential threat. Lee would tell the chiefs that the Mormons would stand back, that the cattle and the plunder belonged to the tribes if they struck the blow. If the Paiutes killed the immigrants, the Mormons would be blameless. They could wring their hands and tell the federal government, "We warned you about the Indians." It was a win-win. The Gentile threat would be removed. The war chest would be filled with Fancher gold, and the saints would keep their hands clean. But plans made in the dark rarely survive the glare of the high desert sun. The siege, September 7th to 10th. On Monday morning, September 7th, the trap was sprung. The Fancher party had camped in Mountain Meadows, a lush alpine valley known as Las Vegas de Santa Clara. They had circled their wagons into an oblong fortification, the tongues of one wagon chaining to the wheels of the next. They were resting. At first light, the valley erupted. Hundreds of shots rang out from the ravines and sagebrush surrounding the camp, the air filled with arrows and lead balls. 7 emigrants died in the opening volley. The cattle stampeded. But the quick strike failed. The attackers had underestimated the Arkansans. These were not soft city dwellers. They were frontiersmen. They were armed with the latest weaponry: Kentucky long rifles and Colt revolvers. Within minutes, the Fancher men had returned fire with withering accuracy. They tipped their wagons on their sides, filled the gaps with bedding and trunks, and dug rifle pits in the center of the corral. They created a fortress in the middle of the meadow. The Indian attack turned into a stalemate. For the next 3 days, a slow-motion horror unfolded. The sun beat down. The water supply ran out. The emigrants were pinned. But they were alive, and they were watching. And this is where the plan began to rot. The thicket is that moment in a crime where the cover-up becomes more dangerous than the original act. During the siege, the Paiutes, who had been promised an easy victory, began to waver. They were taking casualties. They looked to their Mormon brothers for help. To sustain the siege, the militia had to get closer. They had to guide the fire. Men from Cedar City and Parowan crept into the ravines, painting their faces with mud and charcoal, donning blankets to look like natives. But the disguise was imperfect. At some point on Wednesday or Thursday, the emigrants saw something. Perhaps the charcoal wiped off a sweaty brow. Perhaps a man shouted an order in English. Perhaps the distinctive blue of a militia tunic flashed in the sun. The realization inside the wagon circle must have been shattering. They weren't fighting savages. They were fighting the local militia. 2 brave men from the Fancher party, William Ade and another unidentified rider, attempted a desperate breakout. They slipped through the lines at night, galloping for Cedar City to beg for help from the local authorities, unaware that the authorities were the ones shooting at them. They were intercepted by the militia. One was killed instantly. The other, William Ade, was shot in the face but managed to crawl back to the wagon train. He lived long enough to gasp out the truth to Captain Fancher. It's not Indians. It's the Mormons. This revelation changed the physics of the universe for Isaac Haight and John D. Lee. The plan had been a massacre by savages. If the Fancher party escaped now, or even if a single witness survived to reach California, they would tell the world that the Mormon militia had attacked American citizens. The narrative of persecuted saints would collapse. The U.S. Army would have a legal justification to hang Brigham Young and burn the settlements to the ground. They couldn't go back. They couldn't let them go. To release the emigrants was suicide. To kill them was damnation. In a panic, the leadership in Cedar City realized they were in over their heads. They needed air cover. They needed the profit. On late Monday or Tuesday, they dispatched a rider, James Haslam, to Salt Lake City to ask Brigham Young for explicit orders. What do we do with the immigrants? Haslam rode like a man possessed. He changed horses every few hours, riding the flesh off the animals. He covered the 300 miles in an impossible time, arriving in Salt Lake just as Brigham Young was finishing a meeting. Young read the message. He looked at Haslam, sweat-stained and trembling. He wrote a reply immediately. The contents of that letter are one of history's great what-ifs. Young wrote, "In regard to emigration trains passing through our settlements, we must not interfere with them until they are first notified to keep away. You must not meddle with them. The Indians we expect will do as they please, but you should try and preserve good feelings with them. There are no other trains going south that I know of. If those who are there will leave, let them go in peace." Young handed the letter to Haslam. "Go with all speed," he said. "Spare no horse flesh. The emigrants must not be meddled with if it can be helped. But time is the one thing you cannot negotiate with." While Haslam was pounding the dust on the return trip, the men in Cedar City and Parowan held a final council on Friday, September 11th. They didn't know what Young would say. They only knew that the emigrants had seen them. The secret was out. Isaac Haight, Dame, and the others made the calculus. They voted. The order was issued to John D. Lee, decoy and exterminate. When Haslam finally arrived back in Cedar City on Sunday, September 13th, the letter in his saddlebag was a cruel joke. He found Isaac Haight weeping like a child. Too late, Haight sobbed as he read the prophet's words. Too late. The wolves had already eaten. September 12th, 1857, the morning after. The twist in this story is not that they died. It is what happened to those who lived. In the smoking ruin of the wagon train, amidst the stripped bodies of 120 adults and older adolescents, the militia found something that complicated their final solution. 17 children. They ranged in age from infants to 6 years old. They were cowering in the blood-soaked wagons. Their faces were streaked with dust and tears. The militia had standing orders. Kill everyone old enough to tell the tale. But looking at a toddler, the logic of blood atonement faltered. These were innocents. They couldn't speak clearly. They couldn't testify. So the militia made a decision that rivals the massacre itself for psychological cruelty. They didn't kill the children. They adopted them. In a grotesque redistribution of wealth, the Fancher Baker children were parceled out to the very Mormon families in Cedar City and Harmony who had just murdered their parents. Imagine the intimacy of that horror. A 3-year-old girl, Sarah Baker, is taken into a home. She is fed, clothed, and tucked into bed by a man wearing her father's vest. She plays with toys that were looted from her own wagon. She is raised to call these people mother and father. For 2 years, these 17 orphans lived in the phantom limb of their own history. They were the living spoils of war, hidden in plain sight, silenced by their youth. The cattle, the prize Durham bulls, were rebranded with the church's cross. The wagons were repainted. The clothes were tailored for new owners. The Baker Fancher party had not just been killed. They had been metabolized by the settlement. The Valley of Bones, 1859. The silence held for 2 years. The Indian story was the official line. Brigham Young reported to the federal government that the massacre was a tragic, savage attack. Lamentable, but outside his control. But bones refused to stay buried. In May 1859, Brevet Major James Carleton of the U.S. Army rode into the valley of Mountain Meadows. He was a hardened soldier, a dragoon who had seen the worst of the frontier. But what he saw in that high desert meadow stopped him cold. The wolves and coyotes had done their work. The shallow graves dug by the militia had been torn open. Carleton's report is a document of pure Gothic horror. He described the ground as being white with bleaching bones. He found skulls with bullet holes in the back, shattering the Indian battle narrative. Indians didn't execute women with precision shots to the occipital bone. But the detail that haunts the historical record is the hair. Carleton wrote of finding women's hair, long and braided, tangling in the sagebrush, moving in the wind like living things. He found scraps of calico dresses clinging to rib cages. He found the tiny, delicate bones of children scattered among the rocks. Carleton ordered his men to gather the remains. They dug a massive pit. They lowered the bleaching bones of the 120 victims into the earth. Over the grave, they built a cairn of stones, 12 feet high. On a rough slab of red cedar, Carleton's men carved a simple, "Here 120 men, women and children were massacred in cold blood early in September. 1,857. And above it, on a crossbeam, they painted a verse from the Old Testament. "Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord." It was a direct challenge to the Lion of the Lord in Salt Lake City. It was a promise that the United States government would not forget. Years later, when Brigham Young visited the site and read the inscription, He reportedly muttered, "Vengeance is mine, and I have taken a little," before ordering the cairn torn down. But the memory of the stone pile proved harder to dismantle than the rocks themselves. 1860 to 1874. For nearly 20 years, the case went cold. The Civil War tore the nation apart, and the federal government had no bandwidth to prosecute a massacre in a remote territory. John D. Lee lived those years in a strange purgatory. He remained a loyal son of the church. He pioneered the ferry crossing at the Colorado River, a vital artery for the saints. He hosted exploring parties. He raised his large family, but the ghost of the meadows sat at his table. He was a man marked. As the Transcontinental Railroad connected Utah to the world, the isolation that had protected the perpetrators evaporated. Journalists, investigators, and federal judges began to chip away at the Indian story. The oath of secrecy taken by the militiamen began to crack under the weight of conscience and whiskey. Men talked in saloons. Wives whispered to sisters. The location of the surviving children was discovered. The federal government launched a rescue operation, paying ransoms to retrieve the orphans and return them to Arkansas. A second trauma for children who had forgotten their true names. By the 1870s, the pressure was hydraulic. The national press labeled Mormonism a barbaric relic. The Edmunds-Tucker Act threatened to dissolve the church's corporate assets. Brigham Young, now aging and pragmatic, realized the math had changed. To save the kingdom, the Mountain Meadows question had to be answered. The church could no longer protect the perpetrators. It had to excise the cancer. The hierarchy made a calculated decision. They would not admit institutional guilt. They would not implicate the high command in Salt Lake. They would cut off the hand that held the sword. John D. Lee was excommunicated. He was cast out of the brotherhood he had killed for. He was fed to the wolves of the federal justice system. The scapegoat strategy was in play. The narrative shifted. It wasn't the church. It wasn't the stake president. It was a rogue zealot. It was Lee. In 1874, U.S. Marshals tracked Lee to a remote hideout. He was found hiding in a chicken coop, a fallen patriarch covered in straw and dust. The hunt was over. The theater of justice was about to begin. March 23rd, 1877. Justice, when it finally arrived, was a piece of theater scripted by political necessity. John D. Lee endured 2 trials. The first, in 1875, ended in a hung jury. The prosecution had tried to put the entire Mormon hierarchy in the dock, arguing that Lee was merely a cog in a machine controlled by Brigham Young. The all-Mormon jury refused to convict. But by 1876, the calculus had shifted. The United States demanded a head. The church needed to show that it was compatible with American law. A tacit deal was struck. The prosecution would stop looking at the prophet in Salt Lake City. And in exchange, the church would stop protecting John D. Lee. In the second trial, the witnesses against Lee were the very men who had stood beside him in the meadow, the other militia leaders. They took the stand one by one, painting Lee as the mastermind, the fanatic, the sole architect of the slaughter. Lee watched in silence as his brothers testified against him to save their own necks. He was convicted. The sentence was death by firing squad. On a cold March morning, 20 years after the massacre, U.S. Marshals drove John D. Lee back to Mountain Meadows. The valley had changed. The grass was gone, eaten by overgrazing. The sagebrush was gray and brittle. The cairn Major Carleton had built was a crumbled heap of stones. Lee was dressed in a heavy overcoat and a red scarf. He was led to a spot near the old wagon circle. A coffin was placed on the ground. A Methodist minister prayed over him. The man who had devoted his life to the Mormon priesthood was dying with a Gentile prayer in his ears. Lee sat on the end of his coffin. He looked at the photographer who had set up a tripod to capture the moment. He looked at the 5 men of the firing squad, hidden behind a canvas blind, their rifles protruding through slits. He asked that they aim for his heart, "I have studied to make this man's will my pleasure for 30 years," Lee said in his final statement, referring to Brigham Young. "See now what I have come to this day. I have been sacrificed in a cowardly, dastardly manner." He did not tremble. He shook hands with the marshal. He sat back down. "Center of my heart, boys," he cried. The volley cracked. John D. Lee fell backward into his box. The state had its pound of flesh. The church had its scapegoat. The book was closed. But a story this deep does not end with a gunshot. It ends with the silence that follows. For the 17 surviving children, the execution of Lee solved nothing. They had been rescued in 1859 and returned to Arkansas, to relatives they didn't know. They were raised with a void in their centers. They were the children who flinched at loud noises, who had nightmares of painted faces and blue coats. They became a lost generation. They were the Mountain Meadows orphans, a curiosity to their neighbors, a tragedy to their families. Most grew up to be fiercely anti-Mormon. Others simply wanted to forget. In Utah, a collective amnesia descended. For a century, the massacre was spoken of only in whispers. It was the Indian attack. It was the dark secret in the attic. It wasn't until 1999, 142 years later, that the earth finally gave up the last of its secrets. While using a backhoe to renovate the memorial site, workers accidentally cut into a previously unknown mass grave. They found skulls. They found buttons. They found the tiny bones of children. Forensic anthropologists examined the remains. The science confirmed what the oral histories had always claimed. The victims had not been killed in a chaotic battle. They had been executed. The bullet trajectories were execution style. Point-blank range. Back of the head. Today there are 2 monuments in the valley. One is a granite wall listing the names of the dead. The Fanchers, the Bakers, the Dunlaps. The other is the silence of the meadow itself. If you stand there now, with the wind coming off the Pine Valley Mountains, you don't feel the presence of John D. Lee or the politics of 1857. You feel the terrifying fragility of civilization. You realize how quickly a neighbor can become an enemy. How easily a holy cause can justify a hellish act. The Mountain Meadows Massacre is not just a story about Mormons and Arkansans. It is a mirror. Under the right pressure, what would you be capable of doing to protect your own? Before we close the file on Mountain Meadows, we need to acknowledge the architects of the history we've just walked through. The theory that John D. Lee was a scapegoat, a man sacrificed to save the institution, isn't just speculation. It is the life's work of the historian Juanita Brooks. A loyal Mormon herself, she faced immense ostracization to write the Mountain Meadows Massacre in 1950. Without her courage, this story would still be a legend about an Indian attack. The more controversial theory that Brigham Young was not just negligent, but actively involved, comes largely from the work of Will Bagley in his book Blood of the Prophets. Bagley argued that the vengeance doctrine came from the top down. While disputed by church historians, his forensic work on the timeline of the messenger riders is essential reading. We also drew heavily from Sally Denton's American Massacre, which does an incredible job of contextualizing the federal pressure and the paranoia of the Utah War. And finally, we must credit the modern transparency of the Turley, Walker, and Leonard team, whose book Massacre at Mountain Meadows represents the church's own reckoning with this history, admitting finally that the militia, not the Paiutes, were the primary aggressors. The victims were the Fancher, Baker, and Dunlap families. They were American dreamers who died in a nightmare. We tell their story not to condemn a faith, but to remember that no belief system is immune to the corruption of power. That was Silence in the Sagebrush. Written and performed by the author, me, James Cawley. We like to think that the desert is a void where history can be bleached white by the sun and scattered by the wind until it vanishes. But the earth has a terrifyingly long memory. It remembers the weight of the wagons, the sharp taste of sulfur, hollow cold that settles in the marrow when we realize that the shadows on the ridge aren't strangers, but the very men who sold us bread the day before. The sagebrush still stands in that high valley, a gray-green witness to the moment a neighbor becomes a wolf. And the silence that follows is not the absence of sound. It is the weight of 100 lives, metabolized by the ground that should have been their sanctuary. My name is James Cawley, and you're listening to Dust and Echoes. If you like stories like this, stories that unravel the fragile seams of human conviction and lead us into the long, dark shadows cast by our own history, then you're in the right place. If you want to support this podcast, there are 2 simple things you can do. Leave a rating and share your favorite episode with a friend or on social media. It's just me here, so any help promoting this podcast is greatly appreciated. Until next time, remember this. A temple built upon a silenced meadow is just a tomb with a higher ceiling. Any song we sing to the heavens is only as holy as the mercy we show to the person standing right in front of us.